Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Excuse the change in scenery. I was actually in between running errands, so I decided with the couple extra minutes I had to spare, I could go ahead and film another video. So in advance, excuse some of the background noise. I'm actually in my car, and it's still 90 degrees outside in September, so I have the AC on. So I'm coming on here today to talk about my actual baptism story, the story around how I got baptized. In my previous video, I talked a little bit about my childhood and some of the factors that impacted my youth, being raised as a Jehovah's Witness, namely how I socialized, celebrating the holidays, and most importantly, the fear of Armageddon. So I believe that played a lot into my decision to get baptized. So even though I had resigned to the fact that I wasn't good enough and I wasn't going to survive Armageddon and all of that, I decided to kind of give it a fighting chance. I knew at least if I was baptized, even though it wasn't guaranteed that I would survive the Great Tribulation and all of that, that at least I had some chance of making it. I kind of think of it as a person who's been diagnosed with cancer. And with that cancer, the doctor tells you without any treatment, that cancer is fatal. But with the chemotherapy or with whatever treatment that they recommend, you have a better chance of surviving, but you're still at a risk of not making it. And so that's how I kind of thought of it when it came to being a Jehovah's Witness and kind of surviving the things that basically anyone who is not a Jehovah's Witness would not survive in. So I wanted to give myself a fighting chance. So that was the major reason. The second reason was around this time, I was around 9 or 10 years old, and this was in the mid-90s. A video came out that was published by the Watchtower organization called To the Ends of the Earth. This was way back in the 90s, so it was on VHS. But I remember watching that video with my family, and it was basically a video promoting Gilead School. For those of you who are not familiar with what Gilead School is, it's basically a school. I don't think it's a school that's out there any longer. I think they've cut that school out. But it was a school where you had to apply for it, and it was really tough for you to get in. And once you got accepted, you had to travel to the headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses, which at this time was in Brooklyn, New York. And you'd spend several months, about 5 or 6 months, just really doing nothing but studying Jehovah's Witness literature. Just really going into a deep study into it. Not sure what that has to do with becoming a missionary, because that was the ultimate goal, is that you would be a missionary in another country. But that's what they thought was best. So after several months, you would graduate, and then you'd be assigned a country to become a missionary in, where you would preach the Jehovah's Witness doctrine in that country. It was a big deal. Basically, if you graduated, your picture was published in the Watchtower, so it was a really big deal. That's not why I wanted to go into it, but for some reason that appealed to me, just getting out there and exploring other countries. And at the time thinking, I can preach to others about Jehovah, and being really excited about that. But I knew at the time that because I wasn't baptized, that was one thing that I had to do. I had to get baptized first in order to even be remotely eligible for this particular school. So my hopes were crushed when I found out through one of the elders in my congregation that you had to be married in order to be part of that missionary school. And me being a Jehovah's Witness woman or being a female being raised in the Jehovah's Witness religion, you're everything's based on whether you get married or not. Even if you become an elder's wife, a circuit overseer's wife, and in this case, the missionary school, you had to have a marriage partner in order to attend. And my self-esteem was really low. And at that point, I was thinking, even as a 10-year-old, well, I don't know if anybody's going to want to marry me. I didn't really have a good self-esteem. I didn't feel good about myself or my outer appearance. So I figured, well, let me come up with something else to do in Jehovah's service. So that didn't deter me from getting baptized or anything like that. So I remember at the age of 10, they tell you in your literature, one of the things you have to do is pray to Jehovah and tell them that you want to dedicate your life to him and serve him. And at the age of 10, I actually did that, because at the time, I truly believed what I was hearing. And so I did that secretly. And then I went to my parents and told them that I wanted to get baptized. And of course, I knew before I did that, I'd have to become an unbaptized publisher. So my mom said, go talk to your book study conductor, because this is back when we had the book study at the time. And they'll go talk to him and tell him what you want to do, and we'll take it from there. And so I went to my book study conductor at the time and told him I wanted to be an unbaptized publisher, and he was like, okay. And so we went over a couple of the questions. There's this book that only publishers get called, it was called Organized to Accomplish Our Ministry at the time, but they've changed the name since then. I don't know what the name is now. And it was a book you could not get a hold of unless you were a publisher. But now I think the book is actually online. And so they asked me a couple of questions. Some were really strange, like did I smoke cigarettes or betel nut? Had no idea what betel nut was at the time. But asked those series of questions and answered the way I should. And I was approved to become a publisher. So I became a publisher around the age of 10. The funny thing about that was that typically what happens is once you're approved to be a publisher, you're given a month to kind of demonstrate that you're able to handle the hourly requirement of being a publisher. And at the time, it was recommended that you have a national average. So Jehovah's Witnesses have a number of hours that they think you should be out every single month in order to be in good standing. And at that time, it was 10 hours a month. So basically, if you knocked on doors every single weekend, you'd meet that requirement. So they kind of tested me out. And my mom was pretty regular in service. So I just go out when she went out, when she was able, because at the time we didn't have reliable transportation. But did that for a month. And then, basically you also get a nice little Our Kingdom ministry. I don't know if they publish those anymore either. But you got a nice little pamphlet that publishers get that they go over the service meeting every week. And I got one of those. And then the next step is that they're supposed to announce you on the podium. So I went to meetings, month passed by, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and I didn't hear anything. And I was hearing other people being announced as unbaptized publishers, but did not hear my name. And so finally, I kind of talked to my mom and said, I'm not sure what's going on. Am I a publisher yet? And so she went to the elder, and finally they somehow remembered to announce my name. But it kind of again shows how out in the fringes we were as a family, because I mentioned in the last video my stepdad was inactive, and we just kind of didn't fit into that congregation either, because we didn't have reliable transportation. We were broke all the time, and my stepdad was inactive. So that was just another way that kind of showed to me I didn't fit in, because I was so invisible. They kind of forgot that I was a publisher. So I did the publisher thing for about a year, and then I decided that was long enough for me to prove myself. And I decided, okay, I've already dedicated myself to Jehovah. It's time for me to get baptized. So at this point, I'm 11 years old, and I go to my parents, say, hey, I want to get baptized. Of course, they're thrilled because you have your young child wanting to be baptized after all the hard work that they've put in instilling Jehovah's values on you. And so again, I was told, hey, go to the book study conductor and, talk to him. I'm not sure why they didn't come with me, because I was, mind you, 10 or 11 years old. But they kept encouraging me to go by myself. And so that's what I did, even though I was really shy about it. I went to my book study conductor again and said, hey, I really want to get baptized. And so he was like, hey, that's great. He said it was great, but he didn't look too enthused. But, I just kind of didn't think anything of it. And so he said, yeah, I'll talk to the elders and we'll figure this out. We'll let you know. So I was like, okay. So I'm thinking, because at this point I had my Baptized Publishers book, I'm thinking they're going to go over the questions in the back. And I, as a young kid, had looked over those questions over and over again so that I knew I was ready for baptism. I could answer those questions and, nothing would go wrong. So I waited and waited. Several weeks passed by. I'm waiting for, the elders to come to me and say, hey, you ready to go over your questions so you can get baptized at this assembly or what have you? And I waited. So about a month and a half passed. And then finally, the book study conductor called me over and said, well, we talked as an elder body and we don't think you're ready for baptism yet. Your hours aren't high enough. So at that time, we were kind of struggling because, again, we didn't have reliable transportation. So my hours, I probably averaged about 8 or 9 hours a month versus 10 as a kid. And I was going out in service basically whenever my parents could go out in service. Whenever they were able to get a ride or whenever they did have a car, they would go out and I would go along with them. But it still wasn't enough. And so I told my mom what happened. And instead of her being like, looking at the elders funny, she was like, oh, yeah, they're right. You should have talked to the friends. You should have asked them for a ride to go out in service. This is your dedication to Jehovah. You needed to take advantage of those opportunities. And so, I kind of blame myself for not being good enough for baptism. And again, it just reinstilled the fact that I wasn't approved by Jehovah. Maybe it was destined for me to not make it at Armageddon. It just kind of, again, basically secured those insecurities in me. And I think about kind of what my mom said, and it's really interesting because I'm thinking about like all these child sex abuse cases and that are coming out in the Jehovah's Witness religion of these poor kids that were being abused because their parents they assumed that baptized Jehovah's Witnesses are all good people, so they entrusted those people with their children, and those people took advantage of their children. And it's just really sad how an organization just encourages people to have this unconditional trust in folks that they really shouldn't be trusting like that. And so it just really goes to show how crazy that is. I even remember an article that came out in the Watchtower talking about how even though your brothers are imperfect, you still need to trust them because they have your best interest at heart. And it really, again, just goes to show how dangerous that mindset is and how it really does open up the opportunity of children to be abused because those parents are being told to trust any adult that's in the Jehovah's Witness congregation. So at that point, I kind of just went along with what the elders said. I just continued being a publisher. You would think at that point I would kind of question things and wonder what's really going on. But I was still really, really indoctrinated and still was determined to be baptized. But I didn't put as much energy into it over those years. But what I did do eventually over the years, I became a really good student. In high school, I had straight A's, which of course opens the opportunity to lots of scholarships and things like that. And I wisely decided, to go to college because I couldn't think of any other talents that I had or ways that I could make a living for myself. So I figured if I can get a decent scholarship, and I was living in Atlanta at the time, and in the state of Georgia, they have so many opportunities for you to have scholarships and to be paid and everything for just going to school. So I kind of put all my energy into that instead. But fast forward 6 years later, I'm a senior in high school, and I decided to give it another shot. At this point, we're in a different congregation, and I decided to go to those elders. A special day assembly was coming up at that time, and I decided to approach the elders and ask them if I could get baptized. My hours hadn't changed that much, but I decided to give it a try anyway, since I was getting ready to graduate from high school. And so I talked to an elder, and he's like, okay, we'll talk to the brothers. And the next meeting, they had 3 brothers already rounded up to go over my questions. And so a whole completely different reaction, which goes to show you again, Jehovah's Witnesses boast about how unified they are and how they make the same decisions across the board. that's not always the case, because I had the same exact types of hours as I did 6 years ago, and these elders went ahead with the baptism questions, whereas the other elders did not. And so went through my questions. They approved me for baptism, and in May of 2003, the week before I graduated from high school, I actually got baptized. And so at that point in my life, I was kind of happy. I finally got baptized, so I had a fighting chance of surviving Armageddon, which was a relief to me at that time. But what I didn't know is basically the vow I made and how it would impact me now to this day. But I kind of went on about my life. I graduated at the top of my class, and I got a scholarship where not only was I had full tuition paid, but I also got a check, an extra check, just for going to school. So I considered it like my job. And my parents were on board with it and everything. And things were going well for a while. But of course, as a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, both current and former, know, Jehovah's Witnesses have a certain view on post-secondary education. So in the next video, I will actually talk about that, and I'll talk about my college experience and how that was viewed in my congregation and some of the things I went through. So if you're interested in hearing about that, please stay tuned to my next video. Much love.